to our guest of today, Omri Boehm, who is associate professor of philosophy at the New School for Social Research in New York. Omri got his PhD in Yale in 2009, and we have just learned that his PhD research was precisely on the topic of our seminar, so relationship between Kant and Spinoza. And Omri published a very beautiful and challenging book, Kant's Critique of Spinoza, so it came out at the Oxford University Press in 2014. And it's an important book because it somehow changed the image of the relationship between Kant and Spinoza in the current scholarship, since it was still dominated by the idea that the relationship Kant had with Spinoza was completely meaningless, in the sense that, it was also a claim that had solid ground, because we have a famous letter by Hamann to Jacobi, 1795, where Hamann says, Kant confessed to me he has never read Spinoza and he cannot understand his system at all. So, I mean, the scholarship had good reasons not to follow that path. In fact, there are some connection between Kant and Spinoza, and Kant seems to be a persistent presence in, Spinoza seems to be a persistent presence in Kant's work, even before the famous Pantheismusstreit, so during the years that led to the publication of the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. And in this book, Omri Boehm shows that the presence of Spinoza can be found in the antinomies, or in the first and the third, and even in the chapter on the ideal of pure reason. Somehow stressing the idea I had already expressed in a previous paper of this regulative Spinozism that we have mentioned just before. So the idea, so to say, that if reason were left free to abandon experience in order to venture out in the ocean of dogmatic metaphysics, as Kant says, then it would reach a conception of realities, of the real, that is very similar to the one held by Spinoza, so that somehow this would be the meaning of what Kant said, that Spinozism is the true consequence of a dogmatic metaphysics, and also that Spinozism is the only consistent alternative, even though unacceptable, to transcendental philosophy. This won't maybe be the topic of our meeting today, because the title of the talk Omri Boehm has suggested is Prophecy and Genius. So Kant's Critique of Judgment versus Spinoza's TTP. So Omri, thank you for being here. I give you the floor. We are happy to hear your talk. Thank you.
Thanks for the thanks for the invitation to speak at this forum, and thanks for the generous introduction. And also, I mean, you know, at least where I come from now, people just usually say who you are and what you've published. I'm really delighted, Paola, that you actually gave a summary of the main thesis of the work. It's a pleasure to hear it, to hear you repeat it, and it's a very I don't know if the author is dead, but the author enjoyed this what I take to be an accurate presentation of how I see things. So thank you for that. I will say this, and perhaps we can speak about this more also in the session, in the Q&A, so-called Q&A session. When I wrote Kant's Critique of Spinoza, I was trying to convince, let's call it the scholarly community, that in order to understand the Critique of Pure Reason, you need to read it also as a challenge or as an answer to Spinoza's ethics. There is this one quote that you sort of mentioned. Kant says at some point, in fact says similar things repeatedly. He says, if my own philosophy, transcendental idealism, is not adopted, only Spinozism remains. He repeats those statements quite often, in fact. He says in another moment, he says, Spinoza's philosophy is the only consistent transcendental realism and so forth. So what I try to do in my book on Kant and Spinoza is to focus on the critique of pure reason as an answer to this most consistent transcendental realism. The point being exactly that the critique of pure reason needs to refute transcendental realism. It is the answer to transcendental realism. It proceeds, as some of you Spinozists, I don't know if Kantians, but some of you would remember, it proceeds by this sort of immanent critique, in the sense that transcendental realism is supposed to be shown to explode from within, because it contradicts itself. What Kant shows is that if he takes transcendental realism, he can make it clash with its own assumptions. That's, say, the antinomies chapter. The point being, if he assumes the concept of transcendental realism there, that's not the most powerful one, that's not the most consistent one, then the critique of pure reason actually flies out of the window, because Spinoza's philosophy would be the answer to his attack on transcendental realism, to be the consistent transcendental realism that can overcome the explosion of transcendental realism from within itself. What I try to do in that first book, or well, it's not my first book, it's my first book on Kant and Spinoza, and the last, I try to show that Kant is actually fully aware of Spinozism as the most consistent form of transcendental realism. When he's writing, and this is important to put it in those terms, when he's writing the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, that is 81, not 87, which famously came out already after the Pantheismusstreit, which exploded in Germany in 1785. One of the most interesting facts, by the way, about the Critique of Pure Reason is that it has a first edition and the second edition. The first edition is before the Pantheismusstreit, the second edition after. When I started writing on Kant and Spinoza, I wanted to bring out the changes in the Critique of Pure Reason that I wanted to show that those changes take place in relation to the Pantheismusstreit, that now Kant discovers Spinoza like the rest of Germany, and introduces those changes in order to respond to Spinoza's challenge. What I think that I discovered is that the minor changes that you have in the Critique of Pure Reason do not address that at all. So the most interesting fact is that those sections that actually constitute a very powerful answer to Spinozism were not touched after the explosion of the Pantheismusstreit. The only thing, or not the only thing, the main thing that was changed is that the introduction to the Critique of Pure Reason suddenly announces the problem of Spinozism right at the start, what did not happen in the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason. And Kant claims, I'm giving the answer, the critical answer to the Spinozist challenge. And what I try to show is that he's actually right. I mean, whether he's right or wrong about his answer to Spinozism can be debated, but that he's right that the chapters that provide the answer to Spinoza were already there. The antinomies were not touched. No, there was no change in the chapters on the antinomies between 81 and 87. But those are the chapters that are announced in the introduction, provides the rescue of freedom from the danger of, say, fatalism that emerged suddenly with the Pantheismusstreit as a main challenge to which the critique is now being promoted as answering. Okay, there's more to say about this. I will not say much or anything at all about that before the Q&A, if you'd like to address it then. In the end of that Kant's Critique of Spinoza book, I announced the next project. And the project was saying, if we need to read the critique of pure reason as a response to Spinoza's ethics, to the metaphysics of Spinoza's ethics, I think that we also need to read the critique of judgment as a sort of response to the theological political treatise. And I said, you know, originally, actually, I thought that already in my dissertation, that was naive. Then in the book, that was naive too. I thought that I would actually have those as two parts of that book. And in the end, it made a lot of sense to just, you know, write on the critique of pure reason and to say the next book will be on the critique of judgment and the theological political treatise. I haven't done that. However, the paper that I'm about to read is an opening shot of that project. I'm not sure that this project will be carried out in those exact terms, but it is very much already, I think, touching the essence of what needs to be that project, if it will be written or if it will be addressed. And that's the relation, Kant's relation to the problem of enlightenment and its relation to prophecy, which I think he comes to problematize. And with this little introduction, I can just go on and read the paper. It's not a short paper, but I'll try not to keep you too long. And I walked a little bit in order to try to cut it. Okay. That's, yeah. Kant's 1784 answer to the question, what is enlightenment, is well known. Enlightenment, he writes, is, and this is a quote now from the famous essay, man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity, he adds, is, and I'm still quoting, the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. I think this is a familiar statement. His definition has become so pervasive that it is by now difficult to doubt or question it, difficult even to feel the need to scrutinize its meaning. But at least one question about it should be mentioned at the outset, for it will provide the following somewhat untimely inquiry into prophecy a more current significance, namely, what counts as using one's own understanding? What counts as thinking to oneself? The straightforward answer Kant gives in the text, thinking for oneself is refusing another's authority over our beliefs and attitudes, is plausible, but providing a merely negative criterion, hardly sufficient. It only tells us what thinking for oneself is not. Moreover, the more you think of it, the less clear it becomes what a sufficient criterion should look like, or indeed whether the existence of such one wouldn't run counter to thinking for oneself. In this view, at least, it may not be a drawback of Kant's essay that it leaves us hanging vis-a-vis a famous question posed by the Berlinische Monarchist. What is enlightenment? Perplexity is increased, I think, by two exclamation marks Kant builds into the text, which emphasize that the negative definition he provides of enlightenment contains no description, but a command. Sapere aude, have the courage to use your own understanding. By the way, I once argued those were the only two exclamation marks in Kant's whole Werke, and a student came back to me proving me wrong. There are other exclamation marks, but almost none. Sapere aude, have the courage to use your own understanding. Anyone who's not a child of the Enlightenment, in the worst possible sense of the term, would have to worry. Does following this command count as thinking for oneself? Is it not the case that insofar as we follow the Enlightenment's spirit or command, we don't? And that insofar as we don't, we do? Does it sound like I'm somewhat artificially generating a paradox here out of words? I hope it doesn't, and I don't think that it should. In order to see why not, it's worth taking a careful look at Kant's concept of immaturity in the Enlightenment essay. As readers usually remember, immaturity is a tendency to comfortably forfeit thought by outsourcing it to others, the guardians, right? This is a famous, one of the most famous quotes from this famous essay. Here is a quote: "If I have a book which understands for me, a pastor who has conscience for me, a physician who decides my diet, I need not trouble myself, I need not think, if I can only pay," end quote. The structure of such immaturity is simple and familiar. Instead of thinking, I let the guardians do it. However, it is often, and I think frankly always overlooked, that Kant recognizes another source of immaturity, and one that arguably he thinks is deeper and more pernicious to enlightenment than simply outsourcing our thoughts to the guardians. It isn't strictly speaking non-thinking or not thinking, but rather a way of thinking, a way of using one's reason in a dead or mechanical way, which does not amount to thinking for oneself. Call this, I mean, this is not necessarily a good way of putting it, call this immaturity star. I want to distinguish here two senses of immaturity in the text. Call this immaturity star. It is, and this is now a quote from the essay, it is a use of statutes and formulas, those mechanical tools for the rational employment or rather misemployment of man's natural gifts that are the shackles of an everlasting immaturity. That is, the danger that I would make it my habit, my second nature, exactly when I do think, exactly when I do employ my reason, to fall back on what Kant calls, and this is actually important in the coming, fall back on mechanical algorithms, that is more obstructive to enlightenment maturity than simply outsourcing to the guardians. That is a cause why enlightenment might actually not come. Individuals, Kant says, by and large, cannot achieve enlightenment on their own because most of us have made it our habit to fall back on mechanical tools for the employment of reason. Okay. It is for this reason, given this problem of the tendency to fall back on mechanical ways of thinking, that the first thing that Kant does after issuing his think for yourself command is argue that most people actually cannot do this on their own. He claims that enlightenment must first be achieved by, and this is a quote, enlightenment must first be achieved by those few who succeed, quote, by their own exercise of spirit, Geist, to rid themselves of the yoke of immaturity. That is, if and only if this unique few would then, I'm quoting, disseminate the spirit, Geist, of appreciating every man's vocation for thinking for himself, would the public achieve enlightenment as well. So, for most of us, using our own understanding without the guidance of another depends on the guidance of others. Hopefully, my following discussion of genius and Geist in the critique of judgment and the relation of that doctrine to the notion of prophecy will help treating Kant's position here as an antinomy rather than a brute contradiction. To start appreciating the significance of Kant's, we now see, paradoxical, complex claim that enlightenment is using one's own understanding without the guidance of another, it is important to notice that it is continuous, I think really identical almost at first, with Spinoza's definition and rejection of prophecy in the theological political treatise. That too is not often noticed. Prophecy, Spinoza writes, is, quote, certain knowledge about something revealed to men by God, prophet, and I'm quoting, is someone who interprets things revealed by God to those who cannot themselves achieve certain knowledge of them, end quote. Of course, Spinoza begins a book like the TTP, the true opening shot of what some people nowadays call the radical enlightenment, by defining and then rejecting prophecy, because he too thinks enlightenment consists in rejecting another's authority over our thinking. Spinoza and Kant, we may say, define enlightenment in the same way. It is refusing to orient our thinking by the guidance of another who is then, by Spinoza's very definition of the term, a prophet. So think for yourself is rejecting prophecy. Enlightenment is the rejection of prophecy. Here is how my paper will develop. It's slightly complex. It has different moving parts. So I want to give you a roadmap and show you how I'm trying to hold everything together. I will begin by considering Maimonides' theory of prophecy. I want to argue that not Moses is Maimonides' paradigmatic prophet, as so often is assumed, but Abraham. That is, prophecy does not consist in giving divine law. It consists, so Maimonides, in, I would argue at least, in breaking the law and or the norm and presenting a so far incomprehensible, that is new, radically new, model of judgment or thought. I will then say a word about Spinoza's rejection of prophecy, his attack on the faculty of ruach. For the Spinozists of you, you will remember that moment in the theological political treatise, ruach or spirit, right? Ruach in Hebrew literally wind, the spirit of God or the Holy Spirit that Spinoza attacks in those famous chapters of the TTP. And I want to interpret it as a rejection of the new as such. In light of this rejection, I believe the convenient categories of secular, radical, revolutionary, and religious, moderate, conservative fall apart. I suppose some of you would know this well. This is prevalent, I think, also in Italy, obviously, in some ways. Jonathan Israel is an author who's written along those lines. My colleague Chiara Bottici here at the New School adopts this position. I don't, and that's one of, I mean, the reading I propose here is one of the explanations of why not. So those different categories of Spinoza the radical, Kant the moderate, I think are false. Spinoza is a false prophet for the radical enlightenment, for better or worse, or in fact for radical politics in general. That would be my position here. Finally, I want to return to Kant's interpretation of genius and his notion of Geist. This notion, Geist, salvages what had been undermined by Spinoza's attack on Ruach, spirit, and prophecy. That's basically the main argument here. It just contains a retreat from Kant's definition of enlightenment in Spinoza's terms as a rejection of prophecy. Kant, I will argue, ultimately thinks that following the guidance of another, a prophet, is necessary for thinking for oneself. So prophecy emerges as somehow necessary for enlightenment. By the way, this also it also reflects on the Kant's relation to the notion of, say, revolution. But here I'm not going to enter that. That interests me. I think it's important, obviously, in all sorts of ways, but we don't have the time for that. Okay, Maimonides. What is prophecy? Maimonides provides a definition of prophecy in The Guide of the Perplexed, part 2, chapter 36. Prophecy, he writes, is, and this is a quote, it's an overflowing from God through the intermediation of the active intellect towards the rational faculty in the first place, and thereafter towards the imaginative faculty. This is the highest degree of man and the ultimate term of perfection that exists for his species. much to say about this, but to cut a long story short, assigning the imagination the key role in prophetic cognition, as Maimonides does here, is not an arbitrary choice. Whereas cognition through the senses is determined by objects that are given to the mind, cognition through the intellect, conceptual cognition, is determined by rules of thought. The imagination is therefore the only faculty whose operation, at least possibly, is not determined by given objects or prescribed by rules, at least possibly. While this freedom renders it a potential source of error and illusion, it also renders it a possible source of cognition of what cannot be perceived by the senses or conceived by the intellect. As Leo Strauss once comments, quote, since the imagination can function independently, there exists the possibility that the deity may force the imagination into its service for perceiving the supersensible, hence the possibility of prophecy, end quote. Shlomo Pines, by the way, I don't know if people still read Shlomo Pines around, maybe in Italy, real scholars of, real philologists. An important, interesting author. Shlomo Pines remarks at some point, quote, the imagination functions in Maimonides as a political faculty par excellence. End quote. That was a quote. The political function consists not only in the fact that the imagination enables the prophet to receive divine knowledge or to cognize it, but in the fact that it enables the prophet to communicate this knowledge successfully back to the masses who cannot perceive God, truth on their own. The question is now how we understand this communication. And on a common interpretation, prophecy is nothing but communicating or a communication of God's law to the masses. By the way, that's also why prophecy is often perceived as heteronymous, right? Think about Moses as an heteronymous prophet. He gets God's word and he brings it written to the public. Right? This view is often attributed to Maimonides, right? Who it is generally thought considered Moses, or the giver of the law, the Torah, as a supreme prophet. Significantly, also Spinoza, who is again in very good company here, shares this common understanding of Maimonides' account of prophecy. Spinoza attacks Moses' authority by means of undermining prophecy in particular and faith even in more general. However, I want to suggest that this view is off the mark. Moses does not appear to be Maimonides' supreme example of prophecy, and therefore, giving God's law to the public isn't the idea or his idea of what prophecy is. To see why, we may consider his account of the degrees of prophecy presented in chapter 45, book 2 of the Guide of the Perplexed. I'll just give a brief summary of that. The 11th and highest prophetic degree from Maimonides is one in which a prophet, that's a quote from the Guide of the Perplexed, a prophet sees an angel who addresses him in a vision. So the highest degree of prophecy is a moment in which the prophet sees an angel addressing him in a vision. Maimonides explicitly raises in this chapter the question whether it is also possible that a 12th, not 11th, but a 12th prophetic degree exists. That is, that a prophet would also see God directly in a vision of prophecy, not just a dream. But he immediately excludes this as impossible. He insists that all prophets who reportedly saw God belong to an inferior prophetic degree. They see God, but not in a prophetic vision, but rather in a prophetic dream, a mere dream. Maimonides then continues to say that the highest prophetic degree, that of seeing an angel in a vision, receives its sole example, quote, in Abraham, in the time of the binding of Isaac, the Akedah. In my opinion, I'm still quoting, in my opinion, this is the highest of the degrees of the prophets whose states are attested by the prophetic books, end quote. If not mosaic, then, what is prophecy? What is prophecy if not the giving of divine law to the masses? Given that Abraham, in the binding of Isaac, is the highest prophet, exemplifies a supreme act of prophecy, we have to turn to Maimonides' account of the binding of Isaac to answer that question. What is prophecy, actually? As many would recall, the binding of Isaac begins when God, Elohim, addresses Abraham, commanding him to sacrifice Isaac, his only beloved son. We know that hearing this command does not stand for the highest manifestation of prophecy attested by the Bible. Hearing God is, on the guide's taxonomy, an inferior prophetic degree. It's a prophetic dream. And in any case, it's not what Maimonides had in mind when evoking the binding of Isaac to exemplify the highest of the degrees of the prophets, which consisted in the appearance of an angel. Indeed, it is only later in the story that an angel appears to Abraham when commanding him to stop the sacrifice. So one may legitimately ask here, as the rabbis, by the way, repeatedly have, by what authority Abraham decides to follow the angel's command to stop the sacrifice rather than God's, Elohim's command to sacrifice. The question is especially appropriate because this angel is the angel of Jehovah, whereas it was God, Elohim, who had given the initial decree. And one must in any case wonder why, according to Maimonides, it is in virtue of doing just that, obeying the angel of Jehovah rather than God, that Abraham exemplifies the highest prophetic degree. The answer to this question is found in Maimonides' account of the divine names, also in the Guide of the Perplexed. While Jehovah stands on his view to the deity's proper name, Maimonides interprets God, Elohim, as a merely equivocal term. Originally signifying rulers and judges of states, Elohim, God, came only derivatively to signify the deity. More precisely, since deities sometimes serve as rulers and judges of states, they can be referred to also as Elohim. The term's essential signification is just this, the juridical ruling authority. The theological implications of this view become clearer in Maimonides' interpretation of the story of the fall, that's Genesis 3. The serpent in this story states famously that by eating from the forbidden fruit, Adam and Eve will become, quote, like God, Elohim, knowing good and evil. And it is tempting to read this as they will become divine-like by gaining ethical knowledge. But Maimonides reads this exactly the other way around. By the way, Spinoza also reads this the other way around. I don't know if this is extremely interesting to talk about today or one day. I think this is the key. I think this paragraph is the key to understanding the whole of Spinoza's philosophy, by the way, but I'm not going to, I'll just say it and then I will not explain why. Maimonides reads this exactly the other way around. Gaining godlike knowledge of good and evil represents rather the punishment imposed on Adam and Eve. Coming to know like God, like Elohim, consists in losing the absolute knowledge possessed in the garden, the knowledge of Jehovah, confirming instead to the mere norms of the land and the contingent laws of the state, coming to follow Elohim, God. Apply this now to Maimonides' account of the binding of Isaac, and thereby to his account of supreme prophecy. God commands the sacrifice of the Son. Maimonides reads this command metaphorically as standing for the human, all too human temptation to follow the established law and the ethical political norm as if it is an absolute decree. Indeed, and this is now in a way just the point, the pagan ritual of child sacrifice was the established ethical political norm in Abraham's ancient Near East. By the way, it still is. The ethical thing to do was to sacrifice your son. In obeying God, insofar as Abraham is following God, Abraham obeys the common norm. For Maimonides, the supreme level of prophecy consists in managing, despite belonging to this norm, to transcend it, to disobey this norm and to do something genuinely different, sacrifice a ram instead of the son. Here's the angel. Moreover, and this is important, it's important to understand Kant's later position. Going against the universal norm, Abraham does not merely disobeys. He manages to set an example, a model of faith that can be imitated and followed by his sons. Maimonides insists that this is really the crux of the story and of prophecy, with a powerful and I think often misunderstood interpretation of the meaning of the binding of Isaac as a test or trial. Maimonides goes into great pains to argue that the word test in Hebrew, nisayon in Hebrew, the word test in the verse, after these things, God tested Abraham, that's the beginning of the binding of Isaac, does not stand for God attempting to examine Abraham. Obviously, God knows what Abraham will or will not do. Rather, it stands for testing Abraham in order to present him as an example, a standard of faith to be imitated and followed by his sons. And think already of the notion of prophecy and thinking like others. His sons are supposed to imitate him. The notion of trial, or nisayon, consists, says Maimonides, not in the examination, but rather in the act of the tested, this is now a quote, becoming a model to be imitated and followed, becoming a model to be imitated and followed. Interestingly, the Hebrew root of test, nisayon, can be both nun samech samech, standing for exam, sorry, nun samech yud, standing for examine, nisa, or nun samech samech, standing for presented as an emblem or a model. When, say, a flag is being presented, it's mitnoses, it's presented. Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac, in this light reads, the beginning of that story, after these things, God presented Abraham as a model. The reason why prophecy has to be understood as setting an example for imitation can be fully appreciated only once we have considered Kant's doctrine of genius, or that will be my argument. Generally speaking, since Abraham does not follow God, since he does not follow the common norm, what he does cannot be understood or evaluated by available normative standards of judgment. Once God is adequately understood here, this claim becomes a tautology. God is the available way to make judgments. This means that his act is next to meaningless. If it can be meaningful, then only because instead of receiving its meaning from some prior standard of judgment, a God, it manages to set a new standard of its own, one that cannot be understood by those judging within the norm, those who follow God, but can be followed by them. They can follow the prophet. It is not by giving God's laws, but by breaking it and setting a new example that the masses can follow. that Abraham exemplifies supreme prophecy. Okay. Spinoza opens the first chapter of the theological political treatise by providing a definition of prophecy. Prophecy, he writes, is, quote, a certain knowledge of some matter revealed by God to men. I'm still quoting, a prophet is someone who interprets things revealed by God to those who cannot themselves achieve certain knowledge of them. Spinoza then immediately rejects the possibility of such institution, and his, I think, covert argument against prophecy is the following. Sometimes I find it controversial when I talk to Spinozists or to Spinoza experts to say, but Spinoza doesn't reject prophecy. I think that Spinoza obviously rejects prophecy, and here is how I understand his argument against it. I'm happy to discuss in the so-called Q&A. God for Spinoza is identical with substance and nature. This is the well-known thesis of the ethics. When this thesis joins the TTP's definition of prophecy, it follows that all natural knowledge, even empirical science or philosophy, counts as prophecy. Moreover, as Spinoza boldly states in the second part of the Ethics, proposition 47, quote, you probably know this by heart, the human mind has an adequate knowledge of the eternal and infinite essence of God. Therefore, every human mind is in principle capable of grasping God's nature incomplete. In other words, everyone is capable of prophecy to the same degree. But then, on Spinoza's own definition, there can be no prophets. There is prophecy, philosophy, but there can be no prophets. He had defined prophets as those who interpret things revealed by God to, quote, those who cannot themselves achieve certain knowledge of them. Since everyone is capable of prophecy, knowing God to the same degree, there has never existed an individual who interpreted God's revelation to another who was not himself revealed to, who was not himself capable of understanding God's essence. Even if there is prophecy, and there is philosophy, there are no prophets, no people who tell others something that they cannot themselves understand. Spinoza further insists that all those who pretended to be prophets relied on the imagination rather than on the intellect for prophecy. As every reader of the Ethics will know, while cognition through the imagination does count as prophecy, it represents to a certain degree God or nature, it is inferior to the prophecy acquired by the intellect. This degradation of the imagination becomes the clearest in Spinoza's comparison of the prophets to what he takes to be mere poets. Their animating imaginative faculty, their spirit, or ruach HaKodesh, ought not be interpreted as animation by God. It reflects rather the biblical author's ignorance of the causal naturalistic series affecting the prophets or poets' own subjective faculties. Best then, ruach, spirit, expresses talent. The alleged prophet's ability, fully explicable by naturalistic considerations, to effectively use imaginative and rhetorical means of communication to convey what people already think around you. His psychology, the norms, and so forth. God, basically. This attack on prophecy is, I think, ultimately barking up the wrong tree. It is directed at Maimonides, Moses, rather than at Abraham. But it is relatively clear to know, or relatively clear how Spinoza would respond also to the latter, that is, also to Abraham. According to the Guide of the Perplexed, Abraham's supreme act of prophecy consisted in the ability to disobey the state's rule of law and the people's normative judgment, God, and exemplify a new standard of judgment that can only be followed because inconceivable from within the norm. Spinoza would reject both the possibility and the desirability of such an act. First, it is impossible because for Spinoza, the talent of the imagination, ruach, spirit, can only, to put this now in Maimonides' own terms, can only stand for communication with and revelation of God, Elohim. That is, ruach stands exactly for the ability to preach effectively those laws and norms commonly accepted by the prophet's personal and political surrounding. This is what Spinoza attempts to demonstrate when describing the subjectivity of prophecy in those famous 2 chapters in the beginning of the theological political treatise. Thus, prophecy is conducive, if anything, to promoting obedience to the contingent norm, exactly not to breaching it. Second, it is undesirable because revelation of what's beyond mere custom and law is achieved, thinks Spinoza, through the intellect, philosophy, not the imagination. And his philosophy teaches that one ought never oppose the rule of law or the common norm. Or at least would be my understanding of Spinoza's ethics. In fact, considered from Spinoza's perspective of the intellect, one ought never criticize the given. For viewed from the perspective of infinity or eternity, everything whatsoever is an expression of God's power and is in so far good. Every critical opposition, therefore, is not motivated by an adequate grasp of reality, but by a limited, weak, and distorted view of the good. Exactly the limited view of the imagination mediated by custom and false interest, by the inadequate ideas of good and evil. Now, it is forever tempting for interpreters to resort here to the argument that human beings are essentially finite and hence essentially bound to viewing reality from the imagination's partial perspective. This might be true, but I don't think this is Spinoza's position, and it seems to undermine his main philosophical ambition. Spinoza is committed to the view that finite rational beings can afford an adequate grasp of God's essence. Therefore, such beings like us can afford knowledge, in fact, certainty, that everything in nature expresses God's power and is in so far good, even if oftentimes they cannot see how this is the case. Since, quote, from the Ethics, it is of the nature of reason to perceive things under a certain species of eternity. That's the second part of the Ethics, proposition 44, which I assume you know. The rational, free, powerful person never has reason to oppose the current. All in all, Spinoza's account of reality in his opposition to the prophetic power of imagination indicates, I think, that he would subscribe to the common interpretation of the binding of Isaac, according to which Abraham's greatness consists in his obedience to God, embracing God's authority. Spinoza, in this view, I think, can only be a false prophet for the radical enlightenment. His philosophy is rather conservative, in fact, if undermining the possibility of criticism, certainly also undermining the support of the revolution. A lot more to say about this here, but I'm skipping some details for the sake of time. The irony of all this, I think, is that Spinoza's own political, philosophical maneuver is a conscious revolutionary attempt, right? So despite this opposition, inherent opposition to revolutions, Spinoza's own position is revolutionary. He isn't just critical of existing worldly orders, but tries to overturn them. there's hardly a greater revolution conceivable than the overthrow of prophetic or religious tyranny and authority by reason or philosophy. The only rebellion which is yet greater than this is the one that's embodied in the tension between Spinoza as a man and his philosophy, between the anti-revolutionary content of Spinozism and its revolutionary function. Spinoza's, I think, heroic rebellion can only be fully appreciated if one doesn't try to mitigate this tension by interpreting Spinoza's philosophy as if it were itself revolutionary. Spinoza's philosophy is as anti-revolutionary as a philosophy can be, and yet Spinoza, no doubt fully aware of this, rebels. The meaning of this is that he knowingly opposes not just the gods of the church or the state when he writes a theological political treatise. He also opposes his own true God. Spinoza as a man opposes the causa sui of the ethics. Wow. From this perspective, but from this perspective only, there cannot be a greater follower than Spinoza of Abrahamic disobedience, going against your God. But before getting too excited about this, we should not forget that Spinoza's heroic, exemplary rebellion also ended up in what I take to be, that's controversial, in tragedy. Opposing his God, opposing his philosophy, the causa sui, Spinoza forgot to take into account his own prediction about revolutions in the theological political treatise. He argued there that finite creatures tend to be too quickly pleased by novelties, and this is a quote, which have not yet proved illusory. The revolutionary sentiment, he explains, as a psychological falling in love with new ideas that have not yet been proven to be illusory. The tendency to overturn one tyranny, just immediately then to replace it by another. I want to suggest that this may have been the fate of Spinoza's own rebellion. The overturning of prophecy's authority by reason ended up with the institution of reason as a supreme authority, a geometrical tyranny of the principle of sufficient reason, if you'd like, whose legitimacy Spinoza never questioned and never bothered to justify. What justifies the authority of reason? This is why Kant's argument in the Critique of Pure Reason, I think, and in the Antinomies is so important, so welcome, exposing that novel authority now, reason, as illusory. That's, by the way, the exact terms that Kant is using. The transcendental illusion arises when we fail to examine the authority of reason, an exercise that attempts to prevent reason itself from becoming tyrannical. The first antinomy preserves the possibility of rational critical opposition to reality by undermining the second part of the ethics, proposition 44, and the claims there as an illusion, a perspective. If you understand the antinomies of the Critique of Pure Reason, you understand exactly that. A perspective of eternity does not exist. It's an incoherent position to accept. The perspective of eternity does not exist. Reason does not demand that we view all things as good. The third antinomy, the antinomy of freedom, then follows the same line of argument, undermining the claim that every state of the world is a logical outcome of the preceding, and rendering inconceivable the institution of a genuinely new order. Sorry, I said inconceivable, and that's a Freudian slip. Rendering conceivable the institution of a genuinely new order in the world. A quote, that's from the third antinomy, a power of absolutely beginning a state, and therefore of also absolutely beginning a series of consequences from that state, end quote. Kant's denial of knowledge that is, denial of a perspective from eternity, making room for faith, and thereby also prophecy, is in any case not done for the sake of some moderate, conservative preservation of existing orders. It is a first step towards a cosmology of politically critical and even revolutionary enlightenment. Okay, as I pointed out at the outset of the paper, Kant's 1784 definition of enlightenment as using one's own understanding without the guidance of another is continuous with Spinoza's rejection of prophecy. Such continuity implies, at least implicitly, that Kant too would deny possibly the possibility of the new, of Abrahamic disobedience. But in fact, Kant's confrontation with Spinozism in the Critique of Pure Reason had already begun to pave the way to an alternative Enlightenment metaphysics and politics. At some point, reflecting back on the antinomies, writing in the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant writes, we mentioned those quotes, he writes, if transcendental idealism is not adopted, only Spinozism remains. Within the limits of the first critique, then, he both problematizes what he has come to consider as the new tyrannical prejudice, reason, and defends the possibility of a new creation in the world. However, if the third antinomy, and the antinomies in general, made room for the possibility of such a new creation in the world, it also made the actuality or appearance of such a new creation in the world virtually impossible, because it opened up a famous rift between the world of appearance and the world of things in themselves. The same mechanisms allowing freedom's possibility, the distinction between phenomena and noumena, makes the appearance of freedom in the world hard to conceive. The problem, to be very brief here, this is something we can talk about much more, unfortunately. The problem is that free creation cannot follow the same laws of natural events, but then it cannot be experienced in some way. Quote, this is from Kant, the freely acting human agent is not at the same time the author of nature and its laws. The freely acting human agent is not at the same time the author of nature and its laws. I want to begin to suggest that the notion of genius is one of the answers Kant would provide to this problem. The question is, how can a new order actually appear in the world? How can a new order actually appear in the world? That's also a question of a revolution, but again, I'm just briefly mentioning. Kant defines genius in the Critique of Judgment as, quote, the innate mental disposition through which nature gives a rule to art. It's a famous definition from the Critique of Judgment. The innate mental disposition through which nature gives a rule to art. If there is such a thing as fine, beautiful art, it cannot be produced through available concepts known to the artist or the public, the audience. For producing aesthetic pleasure, art must be a presentation of what Kant famously calls purposiveness without purpose. A work of art proceeding through available conscious concepts would not achieve that, manifesting its purpose. Among other things, this implies that the gift of genius is different from an intellectual endowment, for the intellect's operation is essentially bound to cognition through universally available concepts. The point here is that a work of genius cannot be understood by concepts, and therefore also not by the artist herself. Since it cannot proceed by conceptual cognition, it's not just the case that someone else does not understand it. Also, the artist herself is not the authority over the creation. My view is that with the notion of genius, Kant basically invents the death of the author, and that's actually extremely important for his position on universalism, but I'm not drifting in that direction now. It follows from Kant's position that the essential property of genius product is novelty or originality. For a product that could not be constructed by, quote, following some rule or other, if it could be, it would not be purposiveness without purpose. A product that could not be constructed by following some rule or other just is a new thing. It cannot be understood as a result of what precedes it. Moreover, if originality is the essence of a genius product, then freedom is the essence of his activity, producing a new thing without following a given determinate rule. An act that cannot itself be understood by following concepts is an act that's independent of the natural determining causal series, if there is such a thing. Kant speaks of the genius power of creation as, quote, a play that sustains itself on its own, a play that sustains itself on its own. If there is such a thing even as beautiful art, it must be original and freely produced. Anything less wouldn't be the creation of purposiveness without purpose. Of course, not every product that can be understood through available concepts can be described as original or new. There's also what Kant calls original nonsense, originale Unsinn, a product that cannot be conceptually understood simply because it is arbitrary or completely subjective. Such a production of original nonsense is neither genuinely original nor free. Kant would insist that we don't mistake subjectivity for freedom. Such subjective production can be explained then by reference to the artist's personal, if whimsical, states of mind. Now, for Spinoza, every creation pretending to be new would have to be regarded as such original nonsense. For if anything has meaning in Spinoza, its meaning is fixed from the perspective of eternity and cannot be new. In Kant, by contrast, the denial of this perspective has left room, the room for faith, room to explaining a product as both original and meaningful. Both original and meaningful. It is understanding it as positing a new model or a standard of judgment. Even if a product cannot be understood by a known concept, it can be followed and imitated as a standard of judgment, a new rule enabling the production of similar works. Quote from the Critique of Judgment, "The products of genius must also be models. That is, they must be exemplary. Hence, though they do not themselves arise through imitation, still they must serve others for this. That is, as a standard or rule by which to judge." Here's a suggestion. This both illuminates and is illuminated by Maimonides' understanding of Abrahamic prophecy. As we saw, in disobeying God, Elohim, Abraham manages to do something that's meaningful and new in the proper sense of the term. First, following the word of God just is following what can be evaluated through available norms. In Kant, God would be just sensus communis, and contradicting that word is doing something that cannot be judged because it is not judged on the basis of available norms. Second, despite the fact that Abraham's act defies available standards of judgment, its meaning lies in rendering his act an example. That was a quote from the Guide of the Perplexed. His example to be imitated and followed by his sons, that is, the people of Israel, his public. As we've seen, the binding of Isaac's significance, according to Maimonides, lies not in testing Abraham, but in presenting him as a model. That is what prophecy is. Kant calls the distinctive power enabling a genius or enabling genius to create spirit or Geist. This power of production is understood through the ability of aesthetic ideas to determine the imagination into action. Here's a quote from the Critique of Judgment. This ability of Geist to animate the mind is nothing but the ability to acquire aesthetic ideas. And by an aesthetic idea, I mean a presentation of the imagination which brings too much thinking, but to which no determinate thought whatsoever, that is, no concept, can be adequate, so that no language can reach it completely and allow us to grasp it. This account of Geist as animating the imagination opens the door to a special modality of the imagination, one that, unlike other faculties of the mind, isn't available to all, and which is not bound by naturalist principles. It is productive precisely in the sense that it is not determined to action by the understanding or by sensibility, but by the ideas of reason. Those ideas excluded in the first critique from any cognition or knowledge. Recall, the difficulty with freedom that I mentioned was that it cannot appear in the natural world because, that was a quote, the acting rational being in the world is not also the cause of the world and of nature itself. The power of Geist answers that challenge, rendering the imagination a, quote, a mighty cognitive power. It manifests the, quote, the creation of another nature out of the material that actual nature gives it. It processes this material into something completely different and new that surpasses nature, end quote. With this account of Geist, Kant salvages the notion of ruach, or spirit, undermined by Spinoza. On the account offered by the Ethics and the Theological Political Treatise, a prophet's imagination could be at best mere talent, explainable in naturalistic terms, not a power of creating a meaningful original. Kant, in fact, goes to great pains to dissociate what he calls the mere talent of the imagination. Some people are just talented, the ability to furnish ideas with examples of such completeness that could never be found in nature. So some people are just good at giving great examples, from Geist, capable of furnishing the mind with examples that, quote, prompt so much thought as can never be comprehended with a determining concept. It is such examples only that have the power to expand the concept itself in unlimited way, that was a quote, and only in their case that, quote, the imagination is fully creative and sets the power of intellectual ideas in motion. It makes reason think more when prompted by such presentations. If for Spinoza, ruach, spirit, could only present the prophet's subjectivity, Kant insists that Geist and its product can only be universal. Quote, Geist is referred to the universal because it is a kind of divinae particular aurae. There is only one genius. It is the unity of the soul and the world. Shocking that Kant is actually speaking this metaphysical language. This return to prophecy is interesting, and paradoxically enough, I think the key to understanding Kant's concept of enlightenment. I don't have much more, just so I understand that I've been talking for a long time. So this return to prophecy is, interestingly and paradoxically enough, I think it's really the key to understanding Kant's notion of enlightenment. To see this, it is worth considering again the paradoxical nature of Kant's original 1784 command, think for yourself. As I mentioned, a few lines after articulating the think for yourself command, Kant raises the question how thinking for oneself, how enlightenment is even possible. And he claims that individuals, by and large, cannot achieve this on their own. I mentioned that. Normally, quote, one is incapable of making use of his reason because each individual is fond, this is a quote, is fond of his own state of immaturity. What Kant is talking here of is what I called immaturity star, the state in which statutes and formulas I'm still quoting, the mechanical tools of the rational employment, or rather misemployment of reason, have replaced thinking. The tendency to fall back on given concepts when we think, rather than think for ourselves. As I pointed out in opening this paper, despite the self-defeating fact that individuals cannot learn on their own to think for themselves, Kant argues that enlightenment is almost inevitable. And the argument that he gives for this optimism is that some people, that was in the Enlightenment essay, and I read this when I opened this talk, some people, quote, those few who have succeeded by their own exercise of spirit, Geist, in freeing themselves from the yoke of immaturity, would then proceed to instruct others, and I'm quoting, disseminate the spirit, Geist, of the rational appreciation of both their own worth and every man's vocation for thinking for himself. For those who do not belong to the spirited geistige few, thinking for oneself could only be achieved by following the guidance of others, the guidance now we see of Geist. The concept of genius and Geist from the Critique of Judgment allows us to treat this as an antinomy rather than a contradiction. The resolution of the antinomy is enabled by the fact that the works of a genius Geist cannot be followed by mere replication or mere imitation. In the first pass, Kant's position is that, quote, the product of genius is an example that is meant not to be imitated, but to be followed by another genius. So properly following genius or Geist then can only be achieved by another genius who, quote, is aroused by it to a feeling of his own originality. This allows him in turn to exercise, and I'm quoting, freedom from the constraint of rules. In other words, properly following a genius is not following him. On the contrary, it is receiving from his work the courage and inspiration that's necessary for Geist to create something new. In some sense, if Kant is a revolutionary, it turns out that he's even friendly to the notion of perpetual revolution. You follow one revolution by having another, but we will not talk about this now. This does not mean, I want to claim, that those who do not themselves enjoy the power of Geist undermine their capacity to think for themselves by following their example of genius. Far from it, and here lies, I think, really the essence of Kant's mature account of what enlightenment is. The mark of a genius work is exactly the fact that it presents an aesthetic idea, but without providing a determining concept. This was a quote from the Critique of Judgment, quote, this ability of Geist to animate the mind is to produce a presentation of the imagination. Note the language here and think of the Enlightenment essay, Enlightenment Thinking for Yourself. The ability of Geist to animate the mind is to produce a presentation of the imagination which brings too much thinking, but which no determining concept whatsoever can be adequate, end quote. Following the guidance of genius then cannot result in stopping to think for yourself. Geist's work provides no determining concept that can then serve as a resting place to reason, to borrow another term that Kant would use about Spinoza in a different occasion. In fact, given what I call the maturity star, it is only by following genius work that one can come to think for oneself, for only such work can liberate from the comfortable state in which we just fall back on statutes and formulas. The mechanical, this is a quote, the mechanical tools of the rational employment of man's natural gift, the fetters of and everlasting immaturity. In other words, if we have this tendency not to think for ourselves, even when we do think, to just fall back on common ways of thinking, on prescribed, pre-chewed concepts, it is a work of genius that demands thinking. Most of us need to be confronted with a work of genius in order to overcome the tendency to mechanically produce knowledge, and knowledge that's available through determining concepts. With this notion of Geist, then, with this return to prophecy, really, think that Kant's concept of enlightenment undergoes a revision, but one which has been pregnant in it all along. I like thinking of it as Kant's mature concept of enlightenment. First, sapere aude has to be omitted. Enlightenment is exactly not about daring to know. Kant could have almost opened the Critique of Pure Reason saying, I had to deny knowledge in order to make room for thinking. His mature enlightenment slogan should rather read, dare to follow the guidance of another. Have the courage to think for yourself. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you, Omri. Very rich, extremely rich talk, very interesting in its many aspects. So I have a huge variety of questions, but I would prefer to hear if our audience has questions too. So wait that I try and see them all together. So question time is open. Does anyone want to intervene? You can just raise your hand through this tool Reaction, or write it in the chat, or just start the video and then start talking. So if no one dares yet, I would maybe start, so begin the discussion with a few things. I don't know where I actually should begin from. Maybe from the last thing you said, when you were trying to give a kind of new interpretation of Kant's motto in the Enlightenment, which should correct the old idea that it is a sapere aude, but should go in the direction, have the courage to use your own reason, to use your own intellect. So that the genius seems to be the hero of the Enlightenment, of Kant's idea of the Enlightenment, because he's actually the one who is not committed to special norms or rules, who's not imitating someone else, but without following any precise purpose, any precise rule, invents or produces something that is original and free. No? So liberty and originality are the two marks of the genius. I was thinking about the idea of have the courage to use your own intellect. And I was leading it back to what Kant says in the Doctrine of Method of the Critique of Pure Reason, where he makes this difference between cognitio ex datis and ex principis. That goes back to an old Wolffian distinction between cognitio historica and cognitio philosophica. So that the cognitio historica is something that is just for hearsay, or something according to which you know that something has happened. Whereas the cognitio philosophica is the cognition, so the knowledge of the why something has happened. And that's what Kant reproaches to Wolffians, or to those who follow a genius, in your, using your terms. If the genius is the one who manages to break with old models, with old rules, and has the courage to think by himself, then those who just follow that as a model, so in a kind of mechanical repeating that kind of model, are those who, as Kant says there, have a historical knowledge of philosophy, which is something that is a kind of contradictio in adjecto. So if you don't want to have a historical knowledge of philosophy, you have to practice philosophy. So you don't have to learn a philosophy, but to philosophize, as he says. And it means you have to detach those rules that are the rules of thinking that are at the end reducible to the critical thinking. So to the idea that you have to test everything through reason, so through the image of the tribunal. And it doesn't go, in my opinion, in the direction of the genius. So one can think by himself, so think without being guided, think without imitating models, think without having a path that is already traced and just has to be followed. But it doesn't mean to go in the direction of the genius. So the genius is not the hero of the Enlightenment Schrift, but those who know how to philosophize, so know how not to repeat mechanically something that has already been described. So maybe my question was a bit confused. I'd like to hear your opinion on that.
I think that I understand the question, and I think that I understand the question. I think that the two concepts, the two competing concepts of cognition that you allude to, this Wolffian distinction, and then the reproachment of, or the reproach of those thinkers who are, well, in that sense, not for Kant, not even thinkers, really, those who study philosophy as history. It's interesting to think about this as a comment about some ways in which the history of philosophy is being done in some places, not the way I think of the so-called history of philosophy, but never mind. I think that this account and criticism of different forms of cognition, they still proceed from within an account of knowledge. They're still about a certain understanding of what knowledge is and how philosophy is supposed to be produced. The question that I think we need to put on the table is whether knowledge is the main engine of enlightenment at all for Kant. And I'm not convinced. In fact, I'm personally pretty much convinced that that's precisely Kant's point, that knowledge and its production is not the main engine of enlightenment and ought not to be the main engine of enlightenment. Knowledge is, to be sure, extremely important. Science is important. Philosophy is important. But, and we can distinguish within those concepts, within knowledge, which is important, different concepts of how to think of a good way of going about knowledge and philosophy and a bad way of going about knowledge and philosophy. And what I don't see is, I understand you're in good company. I understand the pressures and the tendency and the tradition of understanding enlightenment as tied to knowledge and to science. But I think that Kant's whole point from the get-go is that knowledge is not the main engine, ought not be the main engine of enlightenment. And I guess the most obvious way to see this is to see that the critique of pure reason begins with this famous claim. I suggest taking it extremely seriously. I had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. The critique of pure reason as a document of enlightenment basically says we have to deny knowledge, we have to limit knowledge. By the way, knowledge is not the origin of universalism, to the extent that enlightenment is supposed to promote a certain idea of universalism. It can only be achieved by limiting knowledge. Knowledge is not the origin of universalism. And so this distinction, by the way, people now associate this sometimes with Hannah Arendt, this very Kantian distinction between knowledge and thinking. Arguably, the two are mutually exclusive in some senses. Think of Socrates.
May I
we can only promote enlightenment by limiting knowledge and insisting on a culture of thinking. And now we have to think, how is that possible? The two versions of a better way of going about the production of knowledge, that's a separate issue.
May I have just a quick reply to what you're saying? That so I completely agree with your perspective in saying that the engine of enlightenment is not knowledge, if you mean knowledge as the set of determinant judgments of science. No? So what you have at the end of the transcendental analytic. That is exactly the knowledge that you have to put apart in order to make space, to make room for faith. And
can I just interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
Because we are in the Society for Spinoza, or that things that you get with Spinoza, arguably. That's what needs to be debated, right?
Yeah, sure. But this part seems interesting to me in the sense that it should go in the direction to see in what sense the engine of enlightenment can be an engine of progress, of revolution or something like that, and goes somehow in the direction of your idea that Spinoza is not the engine of that process of radical thinking that is the basis of modern democracy and so on, so Israel idea, and that the only revolutionary part in Spinoza, if I understood correctly what you said, is to oppose his own idea of God. So I actually wanted to go straight there, but I have to go through Kant in the sense that I think that the engine of the Enlightenment in Kant's view is precisely the idea that that very short-sighted kind of knowledge, that is scientific knowledge, has to be put apart in order to conceive what mainly interests human being. And it means to find place for faith, religious faith, for human dignity, for all those values that belong to the Enlightenment, like tolerance, like a kind of enlightened society to live in. So the age of the Enlightenment of that was promoted by Friedrich the Great in Prussia in Kant's image. But you cannot have it if you consider knowledge in that very small sense that has to be put apart. But knowledge in that very small sense is actually something that is, as to say, the first step you have to walk in order to be able to practice thinking, to know how to think, even in those realms where you don't have the solid guide of experience. So it's a kind of propedeutic work that is only the first very small part that allows you to face the real challenges for human beings. So the realm of enlightenment in the real sense of the word. And this goes back to Spinoza, to what you were saying that I found very interesting, but I think I missed some step of your argument when you said that the only way one could consider Spinoza revolutionary is if one considers how he goes against his own God, so how he opposes his own God and his own philosophy. Could you say some more words on this topic?
I can say a little. I said some. I can try to see whether it's too repetitive or the way I understand. Spinoza's philosophy is any opposition to the current, every criticism of a current situation is already inherently an expression of weakness, an expression of lack of power. And a radical opposition to the current, in fact, not just radical, any opposition, does not proceed from the perspective of adequate ideas. Insofar as you're conceiving adequate ideas, you do not criticize the current, because insofar as you're thinking reality adequately, you see that things are not the way they ought to be, but just as they are. One way in which I like sometimes speaking about this, you see my how I enjoy the biblical relations, but I think that they are driving Spinoza as well. You know, there is this famous story of Job, the book of Job. It's important in Maimonides, and I think that Spinoza is thinking about this too. Job accuses God of injustice. Job accuses God, he curses God for the injustice that he has incurred on him. He demands to know the reason why he's suffering, even though he's just. God famously comes out from the tempest and tells Job, what are you talking about? Who are you? You don't, if you're raising this demand for justice, you didn't get it. You don't understand it. Where were you when I created the world? You don't see that I am just who I am. I am that I am, right? That's the Spinozist repetition on the notion of Jehovah. Jehovah in the Bible is just the notion that God's existence is tautological. I am that I am. That's also the answer to the demand of justice. You want justice from the world? The world just is. It's an anthropomorphic misunderstanding to think that you can demand justice or an improvement or a change, right? The notion of the good is an inadequate idea. That goes back to what I mentioned, that I think that Spinoza's philosophy needs to be understood really as a comment on the biblical story of the fall and the concepts of good and evil being, in fact, the punishment that the punishment of humanity, the punishment of Adam and Eve for eating from the forbidden fruit. When you consider things adequately, you do not conceive them through normative terms. And for that reason, you do not also try to ameliorate reality, which is what a revolution attempts to do. That's how I understand Spinoza's philosophy. And for that reason, I think that whenever you try to break with the current, you're already betraying the causa sui. You're betraying the adequate grasp of reality. Spinoza does it nevertheless. By the way, my Dr. Vater de la Roca, he has this paper. It's called "Getting His Hands Dirty." Well, I think on that I'm just in agreement with de la Roca. Spinoza, if you understand Spinoza's metaphysics, you understand that it's never, it's a wrong way to put it even, right? You cannot say it's the wrong thing to do to criticize a current. It's never an expression of power. It's never an expression of adequate idea to criticize the current. Spinoza knows it. He does it nevertheless. That's the position I'm trying to articulate. Michael would call it, he's getting his hands dirty. He doesn't have to.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So does someone want to ask a question? Our participants are quiet today.
I guess I can be intimidating sometimes.
So I can maybe use the occasion to ask you something else. I'm sorry that I'm the only the only one who asks questions, but better using this occasion. I have problems with your idea of Spinoza rejecting prophecy. Can I ask?
One.
Yeah, can I ask you to go back to that, please?
Sure. Spinoza defines prophecy as a certain knowledge, I'm speaking from memory, but a certain knowledge revealed to men by God. That's the definition of prophecy, more or less, at the moment. However, if I think we follow the metaphysics of the ethics, we understand that, sorry, that's, scrap that, right? We need to be more accurate. Spinoza defines prophecy as a certain knowledge revealed to men by God, and he defines the prophets as those who interpret God's revelation to those who cannot themselves acquire that certain knowledge. That's important. I think if we follow the ethics, we see that there is no individual who cannot herself attain this certain knowledge of God. Why? Because every mind is capable of grasping God's essence adequately. For that reason, even if there is prophecy, philosophy basically, there are no prophets, no individuals on whose authority you need to accept the certain knowledge communicated by God. Right? Every person is capable of understanding God's revelation for herself. Right? The prophets were the ones who perceived God and told you what God said, and the only way to accept it was on their authority, not because you understood it. Since this is excluded, there is prophecy, that's just philosophy, but there are no prophets.
I may be making it too banal, but isn't it true that Spinoza at a certain point says, not everyone can be a philosopher. Not everyone can reach to walk through the steps of knowledge that lead you to the cognitio intellectualis and so on. And in order to reach the goal of the ethics, of being free from passions, of having a good moral conduct, there are people who need another guidance that has a message that can have a kind of influence on their acting. And the arguments of reason, so philosophy, haven't. And that's why prophets act through imagination, not through reason. And so this very well-known and long argument of Spinoza on people who are not philosophers themselves. So how does it match with your idea?
Yeah, so 2 ways. First, I think the modalities are important. the fact that not everyone is a prophet, the fact that not everyone conceives God adequately does not mean that they cannot conceive God adequately. That's, I think, extremely significant, because even those who now communicate prophecy to those who do not do this on their own, they do not communicate it to those who cannot themselves acquire this knowledge. But I think that there is something, so this is actually the simple, cheap answer. I think that there is something more important here. And something slightly deeper and more important here. It is that those prophets who use their imagination precisely do not now communicate prophecy. Prophecy was defined as a certain knowledge revealed by God. Those prophets who conceive God through the imagination and communicate it to the masses, they do not communicate in that, under those definitions, even prophecy, because this is now not certain knowledge revealed by God. And that is, I take it, very much Spinoza's point when he's reducing, deconstructing, you choose the terms, this notion of ruach, spirit, showing that it expresses mostly the subjectivity of the prophets, their psychological state, their temperament, the common ethos of the society in which they live. This is what, that's actually the content of their prophecies.
That's the mean, not the content. That's the mean, not the content, no? The content is virtue, so caritas and... Virtue,
how do you, virtue as Spinoza understands it?
No, virtue as we understand.
That's the point, right?
Justice and equality. I don't know how the English translation.
That's my point. Not good, right? This is not the expression of the certain knowledge by God, and it's not the right concept of virtue.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, to the extent that man's fall consists in thinking through those degraded normative terms, good and evil,
mm-hmm.
This is what those prophets communicate. I see that.
I see your point. Someone is raising a hand. Nicole.
Hi, everybody. So I have a question. I always struggle with the idea that something like geniality is given by nature. Is certain, in a certain way, it reminds me of, I don't know, the idea that the ancient idea that the poet received his words from somewhere else. And in a certain way, for me, it undermines the idea of subjectivity. So my question is, if not everybody can, in principle, be a genius, how can the image, not the words, but the image of the genius be relatable, be effective, be revolutionary?
I think that the answer needs to be that, in principle, everybody is capable of that. That following genius is not producing new artifacts, but even understanding them, or not. It's important that I say not understanding in the sense of comprehending them with a determining concept, but relating to them, judging them aesthetically, already assumes this faculty of genius. In fact, I think it is Kant's position, this requires more work, but I think it is Kant's position on genius that, in some sense, having an aesthetic judgment requires genius. And that would be the way, I think, in which the answer has to go. You know, when Kant writes about the revolution, it's interesting. Some people know this. You know, Kant is supposed to be this dry German philosopher. He famously was also called by Heine as the German Robespierre. I mean, he was an enthusiast of the revolution. How does Kant supports the revolution so enthusiastically. The French Revolution. You know, the famous story is one of the only times in which Kant did not take his famous walk by which the whole of Königsberg was setting their clocks was when he heard about the French Revolution, being so excited and approving. And he writes, and that's now the beginning of my answer. He writes, the aesthetic, basically, this is now not a quote, but basically the aesthetic response, response to the revolution, and this is now is a quote, of the revolution carried out by a geistreiches Volk. That is a Geist that is producing the revolution in France, and the aesthetic response of the nations of the world to it, to the Geist that's expressed in the revolution, is what makes us hope that the human race is progressing, that enlightenment is possible because of this ability of the nations to experience that revolution aesthetically. That would be the form of an answer, but I agree. If there is no ability to even, so the question would be whether the capacity to experience aesthetically is what answers your question, Nicole. Is yeah.
Can I reply?
Please.
In a certain way, I cannot but see the same in Spinoza, in the fact that also the idea of common notions, I don't know if nozioni comuni, I don't know if it's the same in English, it requires that a group of people in a certain way gather themselves, having each of them by themselves, they say, sharing the same nature, sharing the same idea. And so for me, in the end, that point of not following, not repeating, but carrying within yourself as your own thing, what you're sharing with other people can be found also in Spinoza, can be effective and revolutionary also in Spinoza.
I don't see the last part. So I see this that you can carry that this notion that what is the most private, you know, Emerson actually writes about this. This is, I bring it now from a completely different place, but you know, this notion that what is true in your most intimate private heart is true for all people. That is genius. This is now a quote from Emerson. What is true in your most intimate private heart is true for all people. That is genius. I think that I can see that in Kant for sure, and I can see this in Spinoza exactly the way you now put it. I think that's right. I don't see this with the revolution. I think that what is most true in your or intimate in that private heart, I don't know that this would be private, would not be the right word here probably, but whatever. It would be adequate ideas. And those adequate ideas would be understanding God's answer to Job from the tempest. I am that I am. That the man of justice is not that. When you're starting thinking in concepts of justice, you're already starting splitting between you and your neighbor because you have, those are inadequate ideas and they start getting messy and different.
Last thing I would say is that for me, it's really difficult to understand the idea of causa sui, and I struggle with that. And still, I think there is a sort of possibility for creation and for new and for freedom, for simply the fact that when I say it is what it is, I'm just breaking up the idea of the same, and I'm creating the possibility of something that just exactly because it's always the same and it's always creating itself, it's always new. And so it doesn't even, so, but yeah, Thank you.
So let's listen to Matteo Garao, who might have a question. Matteo.
Okay, so I have problem with video, but I can speak. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We don't see you.
Okay, I would like to return to the point of revelation, because I would say that in the theological political treatise, Spinoza argues for the necessity of the prophecy for the society. For example, at the end of chapter 15 of the theological political treatise, it speaks explicitly of the usefulness of prophecy for the society. And I would say, and it is for me difficult to understand this point, that also in the ethics, it seemed to me that there is not such a clear and strong, a clear opposition between imagination and reason. And there is a strong awareness that intellectual understanding cannot override imagination and inadequate knowledge. Also, there is not this opposition between imagination and reason. And I would say that also in the theological political treatise, there is this problem. The content of morality, of virtues, can be also transmitted not with reason, but with other means. And
yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
No.
Is this a question?
Yes.
Okay.
If you agree with this importance, with this necessity of prophecy, a political, a historical necessity, in order to make a difference between history and also Wissenschaft, science, rational knowledge.
Yeah, I understand. I think I understand the challenge. I think it's similar to the questions that also Paola I think had. I can try to answer it again and to even make it slightly more specific. I want to say that the way I understand it, in order for me to be convinced that there is this alternative here to what I'm saying, actually a position much more like Nicole's position would have to be asserted, and I take those to be completely different strands of arguments about prophecy. One of them is saying, look, we live in the world, not everybody is capable of. It's very nice. The thought is it's very nice, all those things that Spinoza says about the ability to cognize God adequately. Not everybody is capable of that, so we need prophets. They're useful. That's one strand of legitimizing prophecy. I heard, Matteo, that you have your German. There's some German in you. Ich kann damit nicht anfangen. That I find as a non-starter. And the reason is that prophecy makes a claim to truth, and that's significant for prophecy. At least coming where I come from. With the Jewish perspective here, that's the point of the prophets. If you take that and you're telling me, and this is not yet the answer, the scholarly answer to you, but it's just a beginning. If you take that and you say, well, not everybody is capable of the truth, so the prophets are useful, they're good for the masses, they can, they help with this teaching virtue to those who are not capable of this themselves. They're a good opium to the masses. That's already seems to me to beg the question. Sure, I mean, we can, if that's a position, which I think is not Spinoza's, we'll talk about this in a moment. If that's the position, sure, that's not prophecy. So what's being granted is not prophecy. I think that Nicole is trying to say something that's more ambitious, and I'm not convinced that it's true about Spinoza, which is that you can actually relate to truth in Spinoza as somehow grounded in prophecy. Prophecy understood now, not because, of course, truth in Spinoza is somehow grounded in prophecy, if prophecy is just philosophy. But there was something more ambitious being stated here about philosophy, and philosophy can now speak about the new. I take the causa sui to be not creation again and again and again, but rather the precisely exclusion of creation. Creation is contradiction in terms. That's how I understand the notion. Okay. Now, Matteo, slightly more specifically to what you said. I think that in some ways it's true that Spinoza is not a friend of sharp distinctions anyway. So, there cannot be a sharp distinction in that sense between reason and imagination. I take this to be just an expression of the fact that ideas can be more or less adequate. The adequacy comes in degrees. But the point is this, the way I understand it. The imagination cannot be the source of adequate ideas. This is basically, once we agree about adequacy coming in degrees, this is basically a tautology. The imagination is a way in which you do not think things adequately. So to the extent that that's the imagination, it can be an expression of some truth, right? Because truths about the prophet are truths about God. The subjective truths of the prophet are truths about God as well, to some degree. But two things about that. First, it's not an expression of truth. It's not an expression of adequacy. And I think that we need to ask a question. This might merit a paper even. I don't claim now to have here just a simple answer, because it's true that in some ways Spinoza would agree to take the prophets as useful. But I can see in Spinoza the deep ways in which they're deeply unuseful, the prophets, right? Because the whole point is that inadequate ideas are the source of violence, war, and bloodshed in the end. Because, as again Nicole also suggested, insofar as we think adequately, we're thinking together in our private hearts, right? Insofar as I contemplate adequately, I agree, Matteo, with your nature, with everybody, yeah? Insofar as I think adequately. Once I start thinking inadequately, then the differences start. The concept of virtue that's promoted by the prophets is necessarily this inadequate concept. And I think for that reason, it's hard to see how useful it is in the end to promoting true virtue. I take the ethics to precisely show me that the concept, I think that you wrote, yeah, charity and justice. That depends how we understand, of course, charity and justice, and that requires reading some Spinoza and discussing that. But arguably the concept of charity and justice is precisely not the true concept of virtue, to the extent that the true concept of virtue is knowledge. That concept of virtue stands in its way. It is Spinoza, not the prophets, who teach virtue, pursuing knowledge for its own sake. So I would be worried about that. I don't see how this redeems a strong concept of prophecy. At best, this weak notion, but frankly, I'm not even convinced of that. That was my position. I'm trying to see if I omitted something, but I think this is basically it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions? So I think that after 2 hours, we can say thank you to Omri Boehm for his rich talk and for the patience in answering our questions. Paolo, do you have a question?
Yes.
Good. Sorry, I didn't see you.
Sorry, I arrived late and I apologize for my absence as one of the organizers of this conference. I was in a graduated commission until now. I have a question on genius in according to Kant and the relationship with the notion of prophecy, according to Spinoza theological political treatise. The kind of knowledge concerning prophecy as a mode of experience, in my opinion, calls in Spinoza into question the productive imagination, but it's still configured as inadequate knowledge in Spinoza. I don't heard the first part of your conference, but I think that Spinoza, the knowledge of prophecy cannot rise to the terrain of artistic productivity, and the form of the experience of genius in Kant implies something more that is, as we know, as Kant said, the free play of faculty of the human mind, which is not limited to the mere imagination, even productive imagination. I want to just make this question about if we agree on this point. In addition, I consider basically Spinoza in the substance of his thought to be a disguised atheist. Therefore, the consideration of the concept of prophecy should also be understood on the basis of this presupposition. And I would like to say, to know what does Omri Boehm think about this?
About the disguised atheist, I'll start with the easy question.
It's too difficult to explain better this concept, but I think that Spinoza is not really interested in the rational theological problem of prophecy, but this is a strategy of exposition of his idea about God as nature and substance, and so on. Well, this is my.
I'll begin by answering the last question first because it's easier for me to answer. You know, I remember when I started graduate school in New Haven. This is what, 2003 or 4. I once had a bit to drink, and I went to the person who would become my advisor at the Luca, and I asked him, Michael, do you believe in God? And he just said, I believe in whatever Spinoza believed in. And since then, whenever people ask me that, I say the same, because I believe in whatever De La Rocca believes in. No, I think that Spinoza is, I'm not sure, I mean, I read him often as a disguised atheist. I think that by the time I get, you know, this is almost too obvious, by the time I get to the 5th part of the ethics, and we start speaking about immortality, and the relation between, interestingly, immanence and immortality, I think that we have left the realm of, let's say, if he's an atheist, then he's atheist, not in the same way in which most of us, I don't know you, sir, but not an atheist in the same way in which most of us are conceiving that term. He's not a secular atheist like most people around me. Here is a good way of putting it. I tend to agree he's an atheist. He's not a post-metaphysical atheist. He's a robust metaphysical atheist. And that's an interesting distinction to make and to think about its significance. But I think, so actually gets a sense that we probably agree. I don't think that Spinoza is interested in the concept of prophecy for its own sake. Very much like you suggested, I think he wants to put it aside. I think he wants to get rid of the authority of prophecy, to make room for his own thinking. And that's basically what I was trying also to defend here a little bit from Matteo, from Paola, from Nico. That's how I see it. Things that there's no room for genuine prophecy. Here's, by the way, since I mentioned immortality, here's one thing that can be mentioned in this aspect. Prophecy will not give you immortality. Prophecy will, in fact, give you mortality. And Spinoza wants immortality. He wants eternity in any case.
Eternity.
Yeah. Okay. That's one thing. The first thing, I wasn't sure that I completely, frankly, heard even what you said. It sounded like I just agree with you, but I wasn't sure. The capacity of genius is not mere imagination in Kant. Kant knows, by the way, someone who wrote about this beautifully, and this is often overlooked, is Cassirer, the son, not the father. Cassirer's son wrote a book about Kant, and people sometimes overlook it. And he analyzes those different senses of the term imagination in Kant, and shows that when Kant invokes in the Critique of Pure Reason a certain concept of the imagination that allows you to apprehend and create in that sense, the concept of genius that Kant invokes in the Critique of Judgment and the concept of imagination there is actually a different concept of imagination that's genuinely free and does not need to follow the same rules of apprehension that you find in the Critique of Pure Reason. I think that so much is necessary, for better and worse, in order to understand that concept. Maybe it means that this concept makes little sense. But Spinoza, as I understand it, obviously has no room for this type of imagination. And for that reason, say artists cannot be prophets. By the way, I don't think that Spinoza is so interested in art for that reason. I mean, that's one of the main differences, right? Spinoza is not interested in art because the imagination and artistic production is not the production of adequate ideas, which are in turn an expression of power. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Last call. Some other question, or we can just say thank you to our guest that was so generous in his answers to our curiosities and the request of clarifying parts of his talk. It was very interesting, Omri. It was a pleasure to meet you and to hear you. So thank you from me and from the organizers, and let's hope to